Welcome everyone to Bedtime Mysteries with Andreajohnsonbooks. I am Andrea Johnson, your host for this evening, and the purpose of this nightly interlude is to help my audience go to bed with a simple thought. Who is it? My shared bedtime mysteries will leave you with many questions. You will always end the evening with something to ponder or decipher. Tonight, we continue with part 6, the conclusion of Parallel Reflections. A family man living an everyday normal life wakes up into something that cannot be explained. What has always been the same is now in question, as this very man finds himself the primary suspect in a multiple homicide investigation. In our previous segment, Charles Thompson had begun to put the pieces together in a puzzle that is more complex than he realizes. However, he was too late to see the trap that had been set in place with his personal initials on it. Our story now takes us to the grand finale, a dark place that takes everything you see and makes it appear to be exactly what you need.
Charles Thompson opened his eyes into a room that was not his own. It was Brad Foster's home. He recognized the furniture. There were voices coming from another part of the house, sounding agitated and annoyed. Getting up from the bed, Charles touched the growing knot on his forehead and winced in pain as he crept to the door to listen. He opened it silently and watched them through the crack. His wife, the Brad look-alike, and the detective he'd given his testimony to were all there. But there was another man present that brought shock waves through to his bones. A man whose face he'd seen in the papers regularly enough to know who he was. Mr. Edward Clifton, the CEO and heir of Clifton Waterworks. Charles felt his head begin to pound even harder from the brutal blow that Brad the imitator had given him. But he forced himself to ignore it. He kept still and quiet. He needed a plan. How many people do we have to get rid of to keep this quiet, Edward? This is gaining too much attention. The lead detective, Carl Mahoney, spoke up nervously. They stood in the master bedroom. The window was closed. I didn't sign up for this. Charles' wife suddenly spoke up, and he felt his rage begin to boil as he looked at her. Edward walked to the window, his gait slow and confident, the pace of a powerful man used to being in control. You will do whatever the hell I tell you to. The final production of the water is complete. The first shipment goes out in the morning. I can't allow anything to interfere with that. We need to eliminate all liabilities, including Brad Foster. He looked at the closed window, his eyes narrowed and calculating. He turned to the detective with an air of finality. You need to take care of him tonight. I can't have people looking into his story. Carl nodded, grunting in agreement. I'll get one of my men on it. I can do it. The Brad look-alike smirked deviously. It'll be kind of cool to kill myself. Edward frowned as he turned his gaze on him. You can take that crap off when you're in front of me. There's no need for it right now. Secretly, the face gave Mr. Clifton the creeps. As Charles stared, the Brad look-alike took some sort of plastic material off his face, and the ground seemed to shift beneath Charles' feet. The man also removed something from his ear that had appeared to control his voice box. The imposter, who was now grinning foolishly and staring at Charles' wife like she was his next meal, was none other than Bob Donaldson, a fellow supervisor at the call center where Charles worked. Charles felt his hands tremble and ball into fists as the full picture began to come together. He watched as Bob put a possessive hand around his wife's waist. As he stared, the plan formed in his mind with sudden clarity. Charles withdrew into the room and closed the door. A little over an hour later, Mrs. Thompson, Bob, Edward, and Carl all went into the room where Charles was laying. He was on the bed where they'd left him. His body was very still, and the sheet was covering most of him. Edward nodded in satisfaction. Okay, let's get this done quickly. Then, Carl, it should be easy to implicate him as an accomplice working with Brad Foster, blaming him for the murder of Detective Stone. But as they made to move forward, Mrs. Thompson frowned, a puzzled look on her face. I don't remember placing a sheet over my husband. Who covered him? The hot breath in her ear was the only warning she received. I did. The knife plunged deep into her back and twisted. Her body jerked like a malfunctioning robot. What the? Before Carl could draw his gun, a second knife was thrown into his neck, embedded deep, and turning the detective's words into low, gurgling sounds. Edward's eyes bulged in real terror as he backed up into the bed, his mind confused and racing. He tried to regain control. Bob, what the hell are you doing? Do you know how much money you're throwing away? But as Edward bumped into the bed, the sheet moved, and a voice replied menacingly. That's not Bob. Edward turned to the bed, shocked at the sound of the voice. He stared, dumbfounded, as Charles rose up from the mattress and removed the plastic off his face. It was Brad Foster, the real one. Edward shook his head, trembling in denial. No, it can't be. I put you in jail. Edward backed up to the wall in cold fear, a slow-dawning realization taking over him. Wait a second. If you're Brad, then who's... He turned around to stare at the man holding the bloody knife. The man slowly removed the plastic from his face and looked steadily back at Mr. Clifton. It was Charles Thompson. I'm the one you made steal a man's life, the one you manipulated, the one whose own wife betrayed him. Edward couldn't retreat any further, as both men cornered him against the wall. And now you are the one who's going to wear the mask. Charles held up the bottle of water. You're going to drink this, and then... Brad stood watching Edward, a heated look of vengeance in his eyes. He finished the sentence. Then you're going to bring back my family, the same way you made them disappear. He pointed through the window.
I hope you enjoyed tonight's season finale of Bedtime Mysteries with Andreajohnsonbooks, and I know it left you with many questions. How was Charles able to obtain Brad's help in taking down Edward and his accomplices if he was in jail? And how did Brad know his family was still alive? Have you figured it out? Let's go over it together.
In part 1, Brad Foster woke up into a nightmare, his family all dead, and the police found him at the scene of the crime. But the one thing that was clear to him was that he nor his family had opened his window. It turns out he was correct. Brad had gone to work that day and took a drink from an unknowingly doctored water supply, and Mr. Clifton's plan was set in motion. The water causing subliminal suggestions to be increased by 80 times the norm. In part 2, an unsuspecting bystander, Charles Thompson, happened to be the perfect patsy. He gave his testimony explaining how he found Brad Foster, which is exactly what Mr. Clifton wanted him to do. Bob Donaldson, who'd secretly been seeing Charles' wife, was the connection. He worked as a delivery man for Mr. Clifton, doing odd jobs. When Mr. Clifton approached him about handling Brad Foster, it was the perfect opportunity for Bob to use Charles, even though he'd told the wife it was for the money. He'd intended all along to frame Charles as a potential accomplice to Brad Foster. Mrs. Thompson told Bob of Charles' rude home, making sure the car was out of order. She knew Charles was extremely sensitive to light, and that it would draw him to the window, capturing the evidence that would put Brad away. But in part 3, Brad was lucid enough to start telling police and reporters of what he believed, that it was Clifton Waterworks that set him up, part of a plan to subdue people in a special chemical placed in their bottled water. The detective dismissed his story, but in reality he knew it was all true and had to find a way to silence his accusations. The lead detective was Carl Mahoney, working all along with Clifton Waterworks, as they were a very big sponsor of the police fund, among other things. Carl told Edward Clifton of what Brad was saying, and they realized it had caused doubts, which in part 4 led to Detective Peter Stone trying to figure out what they worked so hard to hide. But when Detective Stone left the office, he was followed. He told Detective Mahoney earlier that he was going to work late on the case, so Mahoney monitored his computer activity. When Peter arrived at the house, he was so distracted he'd never heard the door open behind him. Peter saw what Brad had been talking about, something Charles later discovered in the video he'd captured. A reflection, his own, staring back at him. It triggered a memory of an image he'd seen in the video, an image that looked like Brad's reflection. But how could Brad be seen in a second window if he was murdering his family in the first? Unfortunately, Mahoney realized what Detective Stone saw and sliced a knife across his neck swiftly before he could utter a word. He closed the window and knew they had to work quickly to cover it up. So in part 5, when Charles heard the rumors of the detective missing, the doubts would not let him go, and his wife knew it, and had contacted Bob and Mr. Clifton earlier that evening. They surprised Charles and was able to get the copy of the video, planning on using it to cover up Detective Stone's death and silence the rumors of Clifton's involvement. You see, the wife had been giving Charles the bottled water all along. It was able to blind him to the truth, make him believe the lies, and become dependent on the liquid. They did the same to Brad Foster. When he drank the water, he believed he had gone to sleep, but in reality, he never did. Bob Donaldson had rented the apartment next door, brought dummies into the place, and covered his face in a special mask designed by Clifton Waterworks. He got the call from Charles' wife that her husband was almost there. He aimed the light that made sure Charles saw him kill what was supposed to be the Foster family. "I don't kill women and children," Bob had told Mr. Clifton when they'd made the deal. "I'll kidnap them, take them somewhere they'll never be found, but I won't kill them." Mr. Clifton grudgingly agreed, providing the dummies, and Bob made sure Charles was the patsy that saw it all. But they did not count on Charles getting a second image. Brad was supposed to be asleep in bed, but at that moment, by a closed window, he stood in a daze from the tainted water, a daze that helped Charles to later on see the truth. In part 6, Charles realized that he'd been set up, and that it was the water his wife was giving him that drugged his senses. He'd made sure to only pretend to swallow it, then hacking it up in the back of the trunk where they'd thrown him. But when they'd lifted him out the car, Bob had punched him in the head, knocked him out for real, just for his amusement. When Charles woke up and heard them all there, and saw who Bob really was, he knew he had to act fast. You see, with the tainted water, you could make a person believe anything. Charles waited for them to go in the living room, and then took the bottled water, putting a little dose in each of their glasses. He then slipped out, opening the window that had always been closed, an illusion that was now revealed, now that the water was out of his system. Poor Detective Stone had never entered Brad's apartment. He'd been in the one next door. Charles hurried to the prison, cajoled the offers with a drink from the tainted liquid, and was able to get Brad out with a simple suggestion. Charles explained to Brad everything he knew on the way there, and they formed their plan. They slipped back in, as the others were still in a daze. Charles immediately killed Bob and whispered the suggestion in the ears of the others, and they believed it, convinced that Brad was Charles, still asleep in the bed, and that Charles was Bob, their loyal accomplice. But Charles wanted them to see who they really were. They saw a mask, and then they saw a man. Charles and Brad was able to find Brad's family, facing Edward. They forced him to give them the details. They'd given his family the water that night and took them next door, slipping them out the window and into a waiting car. With the video as evidence and the files Bob was stupid enough to have on him, they were able to take the evidence to the Supreme Court, arguing the entire state was compromised. The case was blown wide open, and Edward Clifton was blamed for the murders of Mrs. Thompson, Carl Mahoney, and Bob Donaldson. The Foster family disappeared under an assumed name. No one, not even Charles, knows where they went, but you can rest assured that wherever they went, their windows are all closed.
So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. 2 men whose lives were completely turned upside down work together to rearrange the picture so that now the ringmaster will get to experience what it's like to be part of the circus he created. Bedtime Mysteries will return again in the fall at its usual time on Monday nights at 8 o'clock Central Standard Time. You can catch up on all our previous shows by liking my page on Facebook at Andreajohnsonbooks. You can also follow me on Twitter at AuthorJohnson78 or on Instagram at Andrea the Creative Author. You can also visit my site at Andreajohnsonbooks.com. I look forward to seeing you again in the fall, and until then, I wish you a good night, sleep tight, and don't leave your windows open tonight.